This is IST254 Chapter 2. We're going to talk about doing an installation of Windows servers. We're going to go over installation options, upgrading servers, using server core, and working with device drivers. As we've gone through the years, installation of servers has become more and more easy, and each time Microsoft tries to make it easier on us. Sometimes I think too much so because they try to think for us, but it's going to be up to you to decide if you feel like Microsoft is thinking too much for you or not. Installation options can be either done manually or manually meaning interactively, or you can automate it by using the Windows Automated Installation Kit or the Windows Deployment Services. For our class, we're going to do the interactive installation, and in here, you've already started this. You inserted the Windows Server DVD, or used an ISO file, which is an image file that you can actually burn onto a DVD if you wanted to. Unintended installations are something you might consider if you have a whole lot of servers, or even this is even good for workstations, where you might want to deploy a lot of machines at one time. There's many different ways to do it. Microsoft offers you the Windows deployment services, but we're going to talk about just choosing an installation destination at this point. With new computers, it's just not uncommon to decide if you're going to do a hardware computer or use virtualization. A physical server can host many virtual servers, and each virtual server can have full network access and behave pretty much like a hardware server, but there are some drawbacks and some positives as well. Virtual servers don't cost as much. You don't have to buy the hardware, but they have lower input-output speed, so you would not want to use a virtual server for a database server. But you do have the option of much faster recovery from a failure, because I know you guys already know about cloning a server, but also a virtual server doesn't use as much power, where a physical server is going to have a higher hardware cost, but it also is going to have much faster input-output speeds, but it will be much slower to recover from a failure because you're going to have to rebuild it unless it's been in a cluster, or you've got a failover configuration, and of course a hardware server is going to consume more power. If you want to automate your installation, you can use the Windows Automated Installation Kit, which is a free download from Microsoft. You can use it to create an image and to create an answer file, which also helps you even further to automate the process. You can also choose to use the Windows deployment services to deploy an operating system over the network. Be aware that your network has to be set up for Pixie boot, which is pre-boot execution. The network cards as well have to be Pixie enabled. Now there's other things, there's many different ways if you wanted to virtualize your machines. There's VMware, there's Hyper-V, QMenu, or is it QEMU? Sorry, and VirtualBox. And if you have a Apple operating system, you can use Parallels as well. Parallels, the last time I used it, I believe I paid $99 for Parallels, so it's not free. Hyper-V comes pre-installed on Windows Server, certain installations of Windows servers, and depending on which installation you've used, you can either use 1 or 4 or more virtual machines without having to pay for extra software licenses. It just depends on what you have bought and paid for. VMware is also a product that you have to buy. VirtualBox or Oracle VirtualBox now is a free download. Some of the things that you need to remember is that for Server 2008, you need a 1 gigahertz processor, a minimum of 512 megabytes of RAM, and you know that's what I've asked you to use. And we all know that the minimum is not always the best choice, but for the virtualization in the machines that we're using there at the school, you really can't use more than 512 megs of RAM, or your host machine's not going to be able to run itself. Excuse me. You also need to have a Super VGA or higher display resolution. It's important to remember that the minimum requirements are just that, they're minimum, and really truly you probably should even double the minimum requirements, if not better than double, if you really want to have a smooth running system. But the last thing that you need to do before launching an installation is determine the appropriate operating system that you want to use. And this is coming from, what applications are you going to use. Are you going to be using a database server? Are you going to be deploying a web server, just a file and print server? Is it going to be a domain controller? What are you going to use this server for? Because what you're going to use this server for will determine which version of the operating system you're going to use. When you perform an interactive installation, it's a pretty simple process. Once you get the installation started, you can kind of walk away and leave it alone until it's rebooted a couple of times, and then you will start to actually interact with the system and start filling in your information that it's going to ask you for. You also need to realize too that you have to be sure that your hardware is going to support the operating system that you've chosen to install. So some of the basics, you've already done this, you've already gone through and you've looked at the installation process where you select the language and then you click on install now, and then you kind of you pick out your operating system that you're going to use and agree to the license agreement, and then you have a choice of upgrading or doing a custom install. And if it's in our case, we had to do a custom installation. And then you go through and choose the hard drive that you're going to install on, and if you had to enable any special drivers, you can do it at that point as well. And you can choose to create a new partition if you want to divide up your hard drive, format the existing hard drive, delete an existing hard drive. There's many different options there that you can do. The load driver option will allow you to load custom drivers if you have a storage controller, and if your storage device doesn't show up on the screen, then you may have to actually go out and get the driver from the vendor and add it during the installation process. After you've partitioned the hard drive or just said I'm going to use this whole hard drive, because you can actually shrink a volume after you've installed the operating system, then the installation is going to proceed by copying the Windows files, expanding the Windows files, installing the features, installing updates, and then completing the installation. So when you look at your DVD and you see all those different options for servers, keep in mind that all of those options are actually on that particular DVD that you're using, or that ISO file that you're using. And even though you get to choose, also the license key has to correspond. If you're going to put in a license key, it has to correspond with the type of operating system that you're actually going to install. Installation comes in two stages. It installs after you've done your general installation, then you can install features and install updates. And you'll also install any updates that could have been included with the DVD. And if you get the DVD from Microsoft, it's going to have the latest, pretty much the latest updates that Microsoft has put in. But if not, you might have to actually go in and get updates from the Microsoft Update server. Of course, we're not going to do that in our class because we're not going to let our servers get out to the internet, but it's just one of those things that you have to think about. And it can take quite a while to get all those updates on your computer. Now, once you've gotten to the login screen, you know that the default username is administrator and the first password is blank, and then you're asked to supply a password. And then once you're actually logged in, you're going to see the initial configurations task windows. Now, with that window, the tasks are broken down into groups to help you, you know, provide your computer information, like renaming your computer and setting up your network card and things like that. So the first task that you should perform on a production server is to activate Windows. Now, of course, we're not going to do that because we're going to run evaluation copies and we're not going to do Windows updates. But it does say you're going to have 30 days to activate the operating system, and if you don't do it, it's just going to aggravate the fire out of you. You can activate it by telephone if you want to make that call, and it's an automated system where all you do is it gives you a set of numbers and you type in those numbers, and then it'll give you a set of numbers back that you can type in to activate your system. But if you activate it online, the process is going to include an inventory of your hardware, and it's going to assume that if you make any significant hardware changes, that you may have to actually reinstall your operating system. Adding RAM or swapping out hard drives or adding USB devices probably isn't going to require you to reactivate Windows, but say you needed to replace the motherboard. If that happened, then you're probably going to have to reactivate Windows. You also have to set up your networking settings. Server is only good if clients can get to it to get to its resources that it's supposed to be serving. You also need to be careful with naming your computer. Don't forget to do this, because if you don't, you get that long, ugly, randomly generated computer name that's going to drive you crazy later on if you have to do something, because you will be promoting your computers to domain controllers, and if you haven't changed that computer name, you either have to demote and undo all your work where you made your computer a domain controller, your server a domain controller, and rename your computer and then reinstall or rerun the wizard to make your computer a domain controller again. So you really want to be sure to think about the server name. Usually you're going to name it something that tells you what, maybe even what the function of that server is. But then other people use crazy names. At City of Rock Hill, somebody was, I would say, a cartoon fan or something, and they started naming their computers after the Three Stooges. They had Moe, Larry, and Curly, and then they did a lot of the Disney characters. They had Donald and Daisy and Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And I mean, it's up to you. You you get to name your servers unless your organization already has a naming convention in place that you're going to follow. But you do want to, if you're on a live network, you want to update your server. You want to make sure your drivers are up to date, and you may want to even configure automatic updates. I'm not sure I'd want to just automatically download an update and use any updates that come along. But again, that's up to you and the organization that you work with.